This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, taking a deep dive into issues that shape our lives here in Israel. My guest today is the director of the Center for National Security and Democracy at the Israel Democracy Institute. A retired colonel, he served as the head of the Israel Defense Forces International Law Department and was earlier this year a member of Israel's defense team at the International Court of Justice in the genocide case. Dr. Eran Shamir-Borer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much for having me, even if I wish it were under better circumstances.
It seems that the scale of the Gaza War has created a sea change in Israel's legal standing internationally, that Israel is getting embroiled in a legal mess, and not just a legal mess, that it will be very hard to get out of. Is that feeling accurate?
Unfortunately, I totally agree with that. I think what we are witnessing for the past year or so is like almost a tsunami of legal diplomatic proceedings, both at the international level, but also in different specific countries. It's a phenomenon which is not new. I mean, Israel has been experiencing legal challenges in different countries and in international tribunals even prior to the current war. But the volume, the number, and the type of allegations being leveled against Israel now is really unprecedented, not just in our specific context, but also I think generally. I don't think any state in modern history has experienced such challenges. And the ramifications could be really very dire to Israel as well. So I think there's a reason to worry about it.
Yeah, so there is always this discrepancy between what international law is and how enforceable it is, really about whether all these international instances are toothless or not. I mean, people have been talking about how useless the UN has been for myriad reasons, some good ones, some bad ones. Are these ramifications really something that we are going to experience, or is it just, a contingency, some sort of possibility that we need to prepare for, but it's not something that would necessarily shape our future?
Unfortunately, I think the ramifications could be really quite significant to Israel, both practically and also symbolically. First of all, the international legal system has grown teeth over the past couple of decades. So for the International Court of Justice, which we'll discuss later, is a criminal court that has the authority to issue arrest warrants against specific individuals, commanders, soldiers, people in the political echelon. And the state members of the court, over 120 states, have a legal obligation to enforce these arrest warrants. Many states that need to make decisions whether to allow sales of arms to Israel have either already decided not to do this or are still considering their positions. So that's another ramification. I think it gives a backwind to many legal systems when they're considering various criminal complaints filed in their domestic jurisdictions against the IDF soldiers. And also, I think, encourages different initiatives, what we call BDS initiatives, to boycott Israel culturally or scientifically or economically. And we've already started to feel this these consequences. So I think it's definitely there's a reason to worry about this, and also diplomatically, states are less willing to engage, to collaborate with Israel on military or other matters as a result of this. Some of these implications are formal because they have a legal obligation to do so, and sometimes just because they're being pressed by NGOs and their local constituents not to do so.
So many people have argued that this anti-Israel sentiment in many countries, especially in the West, but not only, is driven by some sort of, bigotry. Israel is being singled out, maybe sometimes anti-Semitism. I mean, there's a long list of excuses/reasons. Do you, as a lawyer, acknowledge that there are some legal claims that stand up to scrutiny, other than just, feelings or some sort of bias or whatever?
So I think it would be fair to say that what we are experiencing is part of a broader global trend. Okay, there is less and less tolerance, especially in the Western world, for the use of force. There is a tendency to legalize legal conflicts and to use legal tools in diplomacy and to adjudicate armed conflicts. Less tolerance for the sales of arms, for instance, to states if there is a concern that it would be used in violation of the law. So we're part of this general trend. I do think that specifically in the Israeli context, there are many actors with motivations that are relevant specifically to Israel, anti-Israeli motivations. And this really fuels many of the initiatives that we're experiencing nowadays. Obviously, I think there are many other much worse situations that the world and others could worry about, but they decide to focus on Israel. And if you follow some of the specific decisions, I think there are clear indications that Israel is singled out, that the way that the law is interpreted and implemented in the Israeli context is done in a way which very often lacks sound legal foundations.
So is it a losing battle? Is there anything that Israel can do to, make sound legal claims and expect the court to accept them, as, is done normally in such cases?
It really depends on the arena that we're discussing. So some of these institutions, let's say you mentioned earlier the International Court of Justice, that's a court that's been around for many years, and it decides contentious cases between states. Okay, it's a court that decides disputes between states and also provides advisory opinion to the various UN bodies. That's like the highest legal instance of the UN. That's a court that, by definition, is politics is not devoid of its procedures, of its conduct. When I was a member of Israel's defense team to the ICJ in the genocide case, and we were making our case before the court, even before entering the courtroom, that there's no reason, to actually speaking to I would say, for instance, the Lebanese judge, okay, who's currently, by the way, presiding the court. He's a Lebanese politician, and I think, probably for him and his family to survive in Lebanon, he would probably not decide in favor of Israel. So some of the considerations are really political. Some institutions, they are more professional, I would say. But again, politics is part of it. Still, having said all that, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that Israel could do. First, on the international level, engaging with these direct institutions, engaging with its allies, and trying to have them influence these institutions, but also internally. We mentioned already the International Criminal Court. I think it's a broken court. Okay, it was established a little bit over 20 years ago with a very bad track record of success. I think its decision in the Israeli context are just another indication of how broken this court is. And I think the members of the court, many of them, by the way, are among Israel's best allies. Okay, I think they have.
What do you mean by broken?
Broken in the sense that the way that it's just not successful. In the way over 20 years of existence and billions of dollars that have already been invested by the international community in the court. It's hard to say that it actually, delivered justice. Very few cases ended up in the court. Dozens of arrest warrants are pending without the ability of the court to actually have people arrested. It really lacks legitimacy, and
But that's not the court's fault, is it?
No, part of it, I think, is also the court's fault. The way that the court conducts itself, the way that the cases it decides to take, the way that it implements the law in these cases. So it's already coming under heavy criticism by different states, regardless of the Israeli context. When you look in our case, so Israel is not a member state of the court. There are, I think, very strong arguments to be made against the court actually establishing jurisdiction and applying its jurisdiction in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the fact,
because Israel is not a member state?
Because Israel is not a member state, because there are questions about the status of the Palestinians in the court. The court has not given Israel, I think, a fair right to show that it's investigating allegations by itself. There's a fundamental principle in the court called the principle of complementarity. And the idea that the court would interfere in different situations only if the relevant state is not investigating, prosecuting these cases itself. In the Israeli case, even though Israel was engaging with the court, despite the fact it's not a member state, okay, so Israel was engaging with the court. And actually, the very same day that the court prosecutor in May 20th this year decided to announce his decision to request arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and the then Minister of Defense Gallant, the very same day a delegation from the prosecutor's office was supposed to arrive in Israel for further engagements. And it almost seems like the court was, deceiving Israel in this sense. And then the judges in November 21, when they decided to confirm his request to issue the arrest warrants, so they didn't really consider Israel's, I think, very legit claims on both issues of jurisdiction and complementarity, not allowing Israel the fair opportunity to show that it's actually investigating the allegation by itself.
Is there a serious and rigorous investigation within the army and also within Israel's legal instances about what has been going on in Gaza?
So I think Israel has a very sound legal system, both the military justice system and the civilian justice system. It's an independent system. It has a very, I think, impressive record of looking into allegations of violations of the laws of armed conflict in the specific current conflict and also in previous ones. With respect to the specific allegations that are now, at the foundations of the request to arrest warrants, the main allegation that the prosecutor has brought so far was that Israel has been using starvation as a method of warfare against starving the civilian population in Gaza as a method of warfare, which is a violation of the law and could amount to war crimes and sometimes also crimes against humanity. In this specific case, I think the foundations or the evidence that the prosecutor and the judges seem to rely on are really shaky. And in this specific case, I think Israel still hasn't established a good mechanism to look into this. There's still an ongoing debate in Israel whether to establish a national commission of inquiry. There hasn't been any other processes to look into these specific allegations. I don't think, just to make it clear, I don't think that Israel is or has employed a method of starvation of the Palestinian population. But in the face of allegations relating to, humanitarian aid not being enough or sometimes being delayed and so on and so forth, I think it should be looked into.
What about forcible displacement of civilians?
This is. There are allegations, in this regard. Israel has provided, I think, both operational and legal justification for why it has encouraged civilian population, particularly in the north part of Gaza, to evacuate in order to for its own protection. Now, I think there's a growing criticism and questions, as to why Israel is still not allowing at least some of these civilians to go back to their homes. But that's another aspect that should be looked at.
And you think that Israel has a solid claim to fend off these allegations of starvation, displacement, and other things that might amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity?
Yeah, as far as I'm familiar with the policies and the conduct on the ground of Israeli authorities, I think that generally, I don't think that Israel is employing criminal policies. and where there are allegations and there are questions. And, as time goes by, and I think the criticism on these specific issues is growing. So there is room to look into that. But
well, I'm wondering what's the role that is played by good faith in the considerations of the court. I mean, when the judges or the prosecutors are looking at the public discourse in Israel, all sorts of statements by decision makers, some of them were exactly to the effect of effectuating war crimes. Some members of the ruling coalition said things that might amount to that. Does that play a role? Do judges sit and say, okay, if it quacks like a duck and then walks like a duck, then it must be a duck?
It does. I believe it does play a role. Sometimes it plays an official role, and sometimes I guess there are also other less official influences. But for instance, let's talk about the genocide case in the ICJ. Okay, in order to establish a genocide case, genocide means that there is a clear intention to destroy in whole or in part a group, a racial, national, religious, or ethnical group by killing, inflicting humanitarian strife, and so on and so forth. But you need to establish this clear intent. And usually the threshold to establish this is quite high. And how do you do that? So very often you would rely on statements for instance, by people in the decision-making process of the relevant state. And we have seen, even though the ICJ has not made a decision still on the question whether Israel has engaged in a genocide, and it hasn't. But so far, we have seen that they are relying on different statements made by different Israeli politicians. Some of them are politicians that could be potentially directly relevant to the decision-making processes in the context of the war. For instance, cabinet members. And some are less relevant, but they could serve as an indication to what is being said. Same with the statements made by Israeli commanders. I think there has been an attempt, and you asked me about good faith. I think both the parties bringing those claims against Israel, but also I think people in the court, I think they are lacking good faith in the sense that how they interpret these statements. Okay, some of them are really repugnant. Okay, but there could be classified as more as like a war rhetoric rather than indications of actual policy. But you could see that sometimes these statements are taken out of context or they ignore other statements. But also sometimes, it's not enough just to show that somebody made a gruesome statement, but you also need to show that it was translated into clear policies and conduct on the ground. And I think they definitely fail there. But again, I'm not proud, regardless of international proceedings, I would expect, our politicians to avoid some of the statements that have been made. I think they should be regretted because I don't think that they, comply with Israel's democratic values as I see them, but also it's just not prudent, I think, to do so. So Israel had to spend much time to try to explain these statements, and I hope we could have avoided this.
Yeah, well, there is a question of the statements, but then again the question of the deeds. So do you think that there's really no traction in any of these allegations being brought against Israel? Do you think that, if the court was to adjudicate in good faith and you were able to bring you as being Israel, right? If Israel was able to bring its case to the court and, talk about it in completely professional standards, regardless of political pressure or whatever, do you think that Israel's record, I wouldn't say spotless, but, passable?
I wouldn't say that, Israel should not be criticized to different aspects of its policies and conduct. And, during a war, especially such a prolonged war, and also taking into account the circumstances in which it started and the horrific and tragic events of October 7th. And I think that the significant challenges that Israel's security challenges that Israel is contending with in this war, and the number of soldiers involved. I'm sure that sometimes there are violations of the law. This always happen, and I think when there are credible allegations of such violations, then we have an obligation, again, because these are our values as I see them. We have an obligation to look into these allegations and to investigate them, and to do this in a very genuine way. But to classify Israeli policies, as policies of criminal policies at the level that those institutions need to deal with, I think that's a far fetch. Definitely not genocide, and not some of the other accusations being leveled against Israel.
We discussed several of the parameters of international law, complementarity, and jurisdiction. But what about proportionality? I mean, isn't it also like a very key factor when it comes to the rules of law? And when I mean, this is part of the allegations were brought against Israel, that its use of force against Gaza was not proportional. Is there any truth in that? What is Israel's response?
So let me just say, for the sake of our listeners, like a quick crash course on what the principle of proportionality means. So in the context of international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, when a party to a conflict is carrying out attacks, strikes against the other party, they could be aimed only at military targets. And there always needs to be an assessment between the expected collateral damage, harm to civilians or damage to civilian property, and the anticipated military advantage that would be brought by this attack. And there it's like a balance test. And if the expected collateral damage is expected to be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage, then there's no go, and you can't carry out the strike. Israel has been accused that in different specific cases, it has carried out attacks which were disproportionate. Very often, critics would rely on the number of alleged civilian casualties as a result of the strike. If we're serious about the way that we implement the law, this is in order to look into such claims, you need to look at each and every specific strike to understand what was the information, intelligence, and other types of information available to the military commander making decision on the strike. What did he know about the military advantage, whether, for instance, there's a senior militant in the house or whether there's a arms cache inside this building? And what did he know, what did he assess, or what did she assess about the civilian presence in the house? Okay, so you really need data, you need evidence, you need information in order to really carry out a serious assessment of a specific strike. Very often, critics of Israel, they lack this assessment. It's not an assessment you do in hindsight, just by counting bodies or casualties in the aftermath of the operation. Sometimes mistakes could happen. Sometimes, the military advantage was so high from the strike that it could justify also some collateral damage from a legal perspective. The laws of war acknowledge that sometimes even innocent civilians could die in the context of the conduct of hostilities, and it would still be lawful. Now, I can't tell you, whether there are no disproportionate strikes in this. I just don't know. I mean, it wouldn't be serious to give any answer because it really relies on the fact.
But it's been a year, more than a year now. I mean,
so I think from what I follow, I see that there have been quite a large number of military examinations or investigations into specific incidents where allegations were made. It's not easy to conduct these allegations. Sometimes the information is not in a territory where you control. Sometimes it's very hard. The enemy, you can't rely on information released by the enemy. We recall quite a number of cases where Hamas released, just false numbers about civilian casualties. It's hard to know. What I do know is that within the IDF, I think there's a significant effort to train commanders, to integrate the requirements of the law into the operational procedures. And I'm guessing that sometimes mistakes could happen, or even deviations from the orders could.
But what
could
about
happen.
the investigation mechanisms? As I said, it's been more than a year, in the sense that it's enough time for the army to conduct a reasonable amount of investigations and show them to the court as, look, we are serious in acknowledging the fact that we could have made violations of international law, and we are very keen to keep them in check. Has that been made to a degree that might persuade the court?
So I know that the IDF has and is conducting quite a large number of different types of investigation, and it was also, I think, quite transparent about this. So figures were released, and also specific incidents were also addressed. At this point in time, if we're discussing the International Court of Justice, that's not what the court is interested in. It has more. It was interested so far more in the what I referred to the issue of starvation and humanitarian aid. But this is an ongoing thing. I would say that I'm a bit concerned with some of the part of the public and sometimes political sentiment inside Israel with respect to these investigations. Now, following, looking in other parts of the world, it's always very, very difficult to investigate soldiers for alleged conduct while the events are still unfolding and the war is still going on. Okay, and we've seen from other examples in not very far history, the UK forces in Iraq, or American forces in Afghanistan, or Australian forces in Afghanistan. Very often, these investigations take time. Usually, they happen long time after the cessation of hostilities. That's not the case in Israel. Everything is really happening in very, very fast pace. But we have seen, for instance, that when Israel was conducting an investigation into allegations of mistreatment of Palestinian detainees while they were in custody of IDF forces. So there was an investigation, and Israel was actually exercising its responsibility to look into these allegations. So perhaps our listeners could recall that Israeli politicians belonging to the far right with a mob really stormed into an IDF base, in IDF detention facilities where the accused soldiers or suspect soldiers were being called into questioning. So you feel that the public sentiment, at least in some segments of Israeli society, is very critical of the justice system actually carrying out its mission. And my concern is that it's not only that I'm concerned that that this is where some segments of our society are walking, and that's a sentiment, but also obviously people from the world are also seeing this, and they could be asking themselves, well, are they really serious about having an independent and effective justice
exactly
system?
And it's not just that, because the principle of complementarity is really based on the independence of the judiciary in the country itself. And again, regardless of the war, you see what this government had been trying to do in terms of cancelling or perhaps subjugating the independence of the judiciary to political forces. Again, this question, I don't know, I'm using all these legal terms too liberally, but isn't there the question of intent, right? Again, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it must be a duck.
I couldn't agree more. That there is a room for concern with what the current government is trying to do with respect to the justice system. And I would share with you that prior to this war, when the judicial overhaul was at its peak, I appeared before the relevant committee in the Israeli Knesset, Israeli Parliament. I was trying to explain what could be the ramifications and the legal risks to Israelis and to Israel at the international level if indeed they carry out their plan. But I would also say that the way that where things stand now, Israel still has a very independent, a very effective, a very professional legal system. And I think it would be fair and wrong for different actors to say that because of the intentions of the government that this legal system is no longer meets the required standards. I think our legal system is scores really, really high, even comparing to many of our Western allies, and I think it should remain this way. But it's definitely regretful, that members of the current government, despite the fact, that they understand, that the risks that Israel is facing at the international level, some of their statements, some of their conduct, and definitely their plans do not commensurate, these challenges, and their, attacks against the Attorney General, that has to be remain independent in her decision-making processes. Obviously, it's not helping Israel.
Yeah. I want to go back to what you said about the international community and the international legal system growing teeth. Part of Israel's solace in this whole sad and dire business is the election of Donald Trump. And some members of his future incoming administration have said that they have a lot of power to sanction the International Criminal Court and other. I mean, Trump is famously skeptical of any sort of international cooperation, international bodies, let alone those that harm himself potentially or his allies, like the ICC. And so do they really have significant power to undermine the work of the of these international instances and basically render them superfluous?
So addressing specifically the International Criminal Court, again, it's a court that was set up by a treaty, the Rome Statute, by states. Okay, so it's a creation of states.
And the United States is not a signatory, right?
The United States actually was a signatory,
but pulled out.
Yeah, pulled out, and same as Israel. So neither Israel nor the U.S. are members of the court, but still the court has attempted and has exercised its jurisdiction both with respect to American and now also Israeli persons. As I mentioned earlier, it's an institution that needs to be fixed. And the toolbox that states, especially states such as the U.S., the toolbox that they have is diverse. Okay, and some of the tools there are more I would say classical diplomatic tools, and there are also the more non-conventional tools. It's not the first time that sanctions have been considered in the context of the court. So the previous Trump administration imposed sanctions with respect to office holders within the court. Some assess, that they were successful. I think it's a complicated story to tell, because the fact was that after the sanctions have been imposed by the Trump administration, the court still opened a criminal investigation into the alleged conduct of U.S. personnel in Afghanistan. But when the Biden administration lifted those sanctions, then the court moved the case to the back burner and is really not advancing it. So, maybe it was a good cop, bad cop thing. It's complicated, and probably we don't know all the facts. Sometimes, sanctions, even they are a non-conventional tool, they could be also effective. But I think we need to be more, sophisticated and nuanced in the way that we address the court. As I mentioned, many states that are member of the court, they think it's an institution that should be fixed. And now our Israeli case in the court is just maybe giving just a push to this. But we need to remember that
even sponsors of the ICC, like Germany.
Germany is one of the main donors of the court, and Canada and Australia and Japan. So they're all members, and it's a dear institution for them, even if they're very critical on different aspects of its of the way it has been conducted itself. So they're very critical, and they know it needs to be fixed. We do need to be cognizant of the fact that sometimes, if you really attack an institution, if you attack individuals, office holders in the institution, So sometimes it would make the members of the court, they would urge them to defend the institution because it's dear for them for other reasons, right? It's the same court that also issued arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin in the context of the war in Ukraine. It's the same court that issued an arrest warrant against Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan. Okay, and the U.S. at the time supported the court in doing so. It's a court that sometimes the Security Council refers cases to the court. So I think it's a complicated thing, and definitely there is a room for a correction, both generally and specifically in the Israeli.
But the bottom line
case.
is that we cannot rely on Trump going mad and pulling the plug or whatever. That to an extent,
I think no one knows. When you try to influence both an institution and individuals within the institution, it's very hard to assess what would be effective.
Right.
I think it's definitely true that the support of the U.S. administration, the current one and previous ones, and the incoming is very, very important. Both because it could influence the court if it sanctions the court, and for instance, I know the court cannot handle itself financially because banks are not allowed to deal with the court, and it could have an effect. And also, I think the U.S. could be very a good vehicle to engage with other allies of its own that are members of the court, to bring a change. It's still early to assess, how it would go about, and sometimes even just the threat of the use of significant sanctions could sometimes even be more effective than actually imposing these sanctions. And I really hope that the court, both the prosecutor and the judges, would find a way to take back, to go back in somehow with their decisions so far.
I wonder, maybe perhaps a concluding question, to what extent this could have ripple effects on not just Israel's standing, but also on the question of the occupation of the Palestinian territories, regardless of the Gaza war, regardless of Hamas in Gaza, because there has been this advisory opinion issued recently by the Court of Justice against the occupation, again, regardless of the war in Gaza. Do you think that there's any complementary influence on these two issues that Israel's conduct in Gaza and the cases made against it in this respect might spill over to the broader issue of the occupation?
So I would make a few comments on that. First, it's interesting to mention that the criminal investigation at the International Court of Justice when it was opened back in 2021. Before the current war, one of the main focal suspicions that the court was looking at was the issue of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and different activities around Israeli settlement policy. And, unlike we mentioned the principle of complementarity, where Israel, could investigate itself in order to shield, the court from doing so, in the context of settlements, because Israel does not hold, that that's an illegal practice, and by definition, it's also not being investigated. So this is pending in the International Criminal Court. Another development that you just mentioned was that earlier this year in July, the International Court of Justice, in its capacity of providing advisory opinions to the UN bodies, so delivered a very lengthy opinion, actually discussing the legality of not just the settlements, but Israel's presence in the West Bank. What's the legality of the prolonged occupation there?
And was that a precedent in this?
So it's a very unique situation in any event. But the court did find that Israel should evacuate the West Bank. By the way, by quite a large majority of the judges in the court, that Israel should evacuate its military and civilian presence in the West Bank as rapidly as possible. Also, again, deciding, not for the first time, by the way, that the settlements are unlawful and Israel should seize any settlement policies and evacuate the settlements. Now, this is an advisory opinion. It's by definition, it's not binding, but the court also went the extra mile of saying, okay, what are the legal implications for other members of the international community? And he said, you should not acknowledge, you should not do anything in your policies or conduct that would acknowledge, the legality of these practices. And what we've seen, I think, in the past half a year is that, foreign offices in different parts of the world are now reviewing their policies as relevant to the West Bank. And even commercial companies, even commercial companies, investment funds and so on and so forth, they are now looking into their investment policies and they're running like blacklists of Israeli or other companies that are operating in the West Bank this way or another. So I think we haven't seen the real actual effects of this decision so far. And you asked about whether there is any correlation or interrelation between the different arena. I'm afraid to say that there is, even if it's not a formal one. Sometimes when you're assessing the legality of a state's policy and you think that significant portions of its security or foreign policies are unlawful, I think very often when assessing other aspects of policy, states do this through the lenses of other policies. And what we've seen, for instance, in the context of the Gaza War, is that very often people are saying, okay, that's what Israel is doing in the West Bank, then probably it also applying unlawful policies in Gaza,
and vice versa.
Yeah, and perhaps also the other way around. Yeah, I think we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that the fact that. I'm not saying that it's fair, because many states, some aspects of their foreign policy are false, but it doesn't mean that they need to brush, their entire policy in
But
this.
It's still their policy after all.
But yeah, I think that's a room for concern, especially nowadays, when you hear, politicians in the far right in Israel, calling for reestablishing, settlements in the Gaza Strip, and saying that Israel needs to occupy Gaza fully. I think, it definitely has some influence on the way that people, are assessing Israeli conduct and policies.
All right. And on this note, whether optimistic or pessimistic depends where you're coming from. We'd like to thank you, Dr. Eran Shamir-Borer. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their generous support. And now we've got a request to you, our listeners, because many of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has way more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.